a Soviet bomber aggressively dropped a bomb onto the German forces. Unexpectedly, the bomb hung eerily on the rooftop, teetering and on the verge of falling, yet it stubbornly refused to explode. The German officer was burning with anxiety, watching helplessly as the incredibly valuable bomber hovered on the brink of destruction, completely at a loss in that critical moment. Just then, a Soviet prisoner of war bravely volunteered to help the Germans defuse the dangerously unstable bomb. However, the German officer was deeply suspicious of his motives. With a face full of doubt, he questioned the prisoner, "Why would you help your enemy?" The man simply pointed to his mouth, pretending that all he wanted was a bite to eat. In truth, he had originally planned to hijack the bomber and escape, but never imagined he would run into such an unexpected crisis. In order to escape this hellish nightmare, Devyata had no choice but to grit his teeth and summon the courage to approach the precarious bomb. Every step trembling with fear, he cautiously climbed onto the plane, his hands shaking as he pulled out a screwdriver, silently praying in his heart, then slowly and carefully inserted it into the screw hole, trying to unscrew the bomb's casing. To his shock, just as Devyata gave it a twist, the bomb suddenly fell. Everyone around was scared out of their wits by this unexpected accident. Luckily, at that critical moment, Devyata clung tightly to the bomb, narrowly preventing a disaster. Seeing this, his comrade, fearless of life or death, rushed up the plane to help. With their combined efforts, they finally managed to open the casing. Then, with trembling hands, they unscrewed the hidden bolts and carefully pulled out the bomb's fuse, successfully disarming this deadly device that could have exploded at any second. And yet, this was a true story that took place on the Eastern Front during World War II. Not only did Devyata lead 10 prisoners of war to successfully escape the German POW camp, he also took with him the blueprints for the world's first ballistic missile, the V2, and later helped the Soviet Union develop the earth-shattering V3 missile. The story takes place in 1944, when Devyata was piloting a fighter jet and engaged in a thrilling aerial battle with the German forces. But unfortunately, he was relentlessly pursued by 2 enemy planes and found himself in a desperate situation. At that critical moment, he swiftly lowered his jet's altitude, daringly skimming over the water in an attempt to evade the enemy's fierce assault. However, the enemy's pursuit remained relentless, and he couldn't shake off the deadly threat. In a split-second decision, Devyata made a bold move. He flew straight under a bridge. The 2 enemy planes behind him couldn't dodge in time and crashed directly into the bridge, triggering a massive explosion. In the end, Devyata narrowly escaped and miraculously survived the ordeal. Now even more fearless and determined, Devyata continued launching fierce counterattacks on the enemy. One of the enemy plane's tail wings was shot off, but by sheer misfortune, it struck Devyata's jet, instantly throwing him off focus. Seizing the moment, the enemy hit his fuel tank from above, and his aircraft was instantly engulfed in flames. In this life-threatening moment, Devyata had no choice but to eject and parachute to safety. Tragically, he ended up landing in German territory and was soon surrounded by enemy forces. With a steely gaze, Devyata pulled out his pistol and fired repeatedly at the enemy. Just as he was about to fight to the death, he was horrified to discover that he had run out of bullets. Ultimately, Devyata was captured by the Germans and thrown into a POW camp for pilots. Since pilots were considered valuable military assets, the Germans tried to persuade them to switch sides. To Devyata's utter shock, the officer assigned to convince them turned out to be none other than his former comrade in arms, Nikolai. He was utterly in disbelief Nikolai was actually still alive. In the crowd, Nikolai also suddenly spotted Devyata, and feeling awkward, he hurriedly ended the surrender speech. After the others had dispersed, the 2 long-separated comrades embraced tightly, tears streaming down their faces, as if they had endless things to say, pouring out their longing and concern for one another. However, Nikolai still tried hard to persuade Devyata to surrender to the Germans, claiming that only by doing so could he save his own life. But Devyata remained unshakable, his heart as firm as a rock, thinking only of how to escape this place. Under the cover of darkness, Devyata led a few fellow prisoners in a secret escape attempt. Yet fate is cruel. Their plan was eventually discovered by the Germans, and in the end, they were captured once again without mercy. To force Devyata to stay, Nikolai did something brutal. He ruthlessly executed one of his own comrades. This act completely enraged Devyata. Burning with fury, he struck Nikolai hard with a powerful punch, but that punch would cost Devyata dearly. Those who refused to surrender and were considered extremely dangerous were all sent to the notorious Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where a horrific fate awaited them, being burned alive in blazing flames. Inside the camp, Devyata was fortunate to meet a kind-hearted barber. Upon learning that Devyata was actually a top Soviet fighter pilot, the barber immediately held him in great respect. Quietly, the barber switched Devyata's identification papers with those of another prisoner, allowing him to narrowly escape death. Afterward, Devyata was transferred by ship to a POW camp in southern Uzedom, which turned out to be a secret German military base. However, this place was also a freezing wasteland, a terrifying hell on earth. Here, not only were they starving, but they also had to endure heavy and exhausting labor. While working during the day, Devyata accidentally discovered that there was an airport nearby, instantly reigniting the flame of hope in his heart. At night, the prisoners were herded outside for a group sing-along. During this time, Devyata secretly discussed with his comrades they had to find a way to sneak into the airport to work. Just then, a sudden deafening explosion rang out, and a blazing ball of fire shot into the sky, illuminating the entire horizon before rocketing upward like an arrow loosed from a bow. It turned out to be a rocket under intense development by the Germans. Unfortunately, the test ended in yet another failure. The rocket bizarrely reversed course and came hurtling straight toward the crowd. Everyone was terrified out of their wits, scattering in all directions in a panicked frenzy. It was the first time Devyata had ever seen such a thing. Fascinated, he stood there frozen, dumbstruck. Suddenly, a thunderous explosion erupted from the direction of the prison cells.
Eine dieser Raketen wird uns früher oder später töten.
Hören Sie auf zu jammern, Hans. Wir bombardieren bereits London. Sehr bald fliegen unsere V-Raketen nach Moskau, dann ist der Krieg zu Ende.
After the blast, the scene was utterly horrifying. Wails of agony filled the air, bodies were strewn across the ground, and the devastation was too gruesome to bear. When Devyata rushed over to help carry the dead, he was shocked to discover one prisoner still clinging to life. With no other choice, Devyata gently laid him down and softly urged him to hold on, promising to come back and rescue him when no one was around. Back in the barracks, Devyata racked his brain, unable to understand how the Germans managed to mount such a massive rocket onto an aircraft. But a fellow prisoner quietly informed him that the rockets were launched from the forest, they could fly on their own. This revelation left Devyata utterly stunned. Later that night, once everything was quiet, Devyata secretly snuck out of the barracks, but just as he nervously approached to rescue the wounded man, he was dismayed to find that the man's breathing was already faint. In his final moments, the dying man gratefully told Devyata to take his place and find someone named Kors to escape by boat. As soon as he finished speaking, the man let out his last breath in tragic silence. But who exactly was Kors? This question left Devyata completely stumped. After all, there were countless prisoners in the camp. He could only secretly ask around, but no matter how hard he tried, he came up empty-handed. On that day, while Devyata was struggling through hard labor, he suddenly heard someone call out the name Kors, which instantly lifted his spirits. Seizing the opportunity while the German guards weren't paying attention, Devyata quietly and sneakily followed the voice. However, his suspicious behavior was unfortunately noticed by the fierce and intimidating Vladimir. With his heart pounding, Devyata made his way to the shore and found Kors, explaining his situation and pleading to be included in their escape plan. But just then, Vladimir appeared silently behind him. It turned out they were in on it together. Kors had planned to escape by boat that very night, but his proposal was immediately rejected by Devyata. Devyata believed escaping by boat was not a wise move. Not only was it easy for the Germans to detect, but the speed was as slow as a snail. If they were discovered, it would mean certain death. Instead, Devyata suggested escaping by airplane, since he himself was a pilot, but his suggestion was met with strong opposition from the others. Stealing a plane was next to impossible. However, Kors didn't think it was entirely out of the question, so he decided they would first scout the airport and then make a final decision. Later, Vladimir used a food delivery as a pretense to get the group assigned to garbage duty at the airport. But upon arrival, their hopes were immediately crushed. The entire airport was crawling with German soldiers, like a massive and inescapable net. They had no idea where to even begin. Devyata reassured them not to panic, telling them to wait until lunchtime, when the guards would be gone. Sure enough, just as he predicted, by midday only a single old German soldier remained to watch over them, but they only had 180 seconds to act. Because the patrol units passed by every 3 minutes, the group began a countdown and sat together to simulate the mission, carefully discussing every detail of the plan: how to quickly take down the guard and hide the body, how to reach the hangar, and how to complete all the pre-flight procedures in the shortest time possible. After a round of careful deduction, they were disheartened to realize that completing all these tasks in just 3 minutes was simply impossible. Even worse, all the labels and controls in the aircraft were in German. Though Vladimir spoke German, Translating on the spot would take too long. That meant Devyata had to memorize all the German labels in advance to make sure nothing would go wrong. At that moment, one of the comrades suddenly remembered that the wreckage of a fighter jet identical to the one at the airport lay in a trench by the forest. So Vladimir once again took the risk of sending everyone to work near the trench in the forest. Just then, Vladimir noticed that the Germans' fire for warmth was about to go out. So he hurried over and flatteringly offered to add firewood. The German soldiers were pleased, and Vladimir took the chance to suggest that Devyata go into the woods to collect more wood when in fact, he was creating the perfect opportunity for Devyata to approach the aircraft. Seizing the moment, Devyata quickly slipped into the wreckage, racing against time to study the interior structure of the enemy aircraft. But danger came unexpectedly. A German soldier suddenly stepped out of the cave, heading out to relieve himself. At that moment, Devyata was completely focused on exploring the enemy fighter. Totally unaware of the approaching danger, he quickly grabbed an axe and pried off the aircraft's nameplate with a few swift moves, overjoyed at the thought of bringing it back to be translated into Russian and memorized. But just at that critical moment, the German soldier had already reached the outside of the wreckage. By sheer misfortune, Devyata's hand trembled, and the metal plate suddenly fell, producing a sharp, clear sound that immediately alerted the soldier. The German instantly raised his rifle, cautiously approaching the wreckage step by step. After a thorough and careful search, he found nothing unusual. Meanwhile, Devyata was hiding behind the cockpit, terrified to even breathe, fearing the slightest sound would give him away. Everyone thought this time Devyata was doomed, certain he wouldn't make it out alive, and they were all holding their breath in fear. But in a twist no one expected, Devyata calmly emerged from the forest with a bundle of firewood in his arms, having miraculously survived the danger. Later in private, Vladimir helped translate the German markings on the plate into Russian, and Devyata quietly began to memorize them with great focus. Before they even had a moment to feel hopeful, disaster struck once again like a sudden storm. The boat they had hidden by the shore for their escape was unexpectedly discovered by the Germans. The German officer gave Captain Vladimir a strict order: spare no effort in finding the prisoners attempting to escape. That very night, the Germans stormed into the prison barracks like a pack of raging wolves. Panicked, Devyata quickly hid the nameplate. All the prisoners were terrified, scrambling out of bed and nervously lining up, anxiously awaiting the German soldiers' search. But unexpectedly, Vladimir appeared like a ghost and walked straight to Devyata's side, stopping abruptly behind him. Then, without warning, he turned and climbed onto Devyata's bed, beginning an intense and suffocating search.
Was ist da, Sokolov?
Na schon. Ich habe gefunden, womit geglimpert hat.
Was steht da?
Fruchtapfelkeit.
Verbotene Gegenstände? Beschlagnahmt.
Fortunately, at the last second, Vladimir secretly swapped the nameplate just in time, allowing Devyata to escape the crisis by a hair's breadth. Even so, he was scared half to death. The German officer left reluctantly, but then suddenly paused, casting a resentful glare at the informant, clearly dissatisfied and doubtful about the accuracy of the intelligence he'd been given. The next day during labor, after some discussion, they decided to take action that very day to avoid further complications. At noon, when the German guards went to lunch, they immediately split up and moved into position. Vladimir quickly stepped forward to chat with the old German guard, deliberately trying to distract him. Meanwhile, another comrade gripped a hammer tightly, quietly circling behind the guard, ready to strike when the time was right. Just as the comrade raised the hammer and was about to strike, a sudden, thunderous explosion shook the entire area. It turned out to be a Soviet bomber unleashing a storm of overwhelming airstrikes on the German forces. Everyone was thrown into chaos, panicking and fleeing in every direction, desperately searching for cover. Devyata frantically prayed in his heart, "Please don't hit the hangar." But right at that fateful moment, a shell landed squarely on the roof of the hangar. Devyata's heart immediately sank into the abyss. Yet when they cautiously opened the hangar doors, they were stunned to find the bomb had landed directly above the plane but hadn't exploded. It was a miracle in the midst of disaster, but to protect the aircraft they needed for escape, Devyata risked everything, fearlessly volunteering himself to the German officer, insisting on defusing the deadly bomb. After surviving a life-threatening ordeal, he finally succeeded in disarming the bomb. Devyata's heroic and nerve-wracking act saved an incredibly valuable asset for the German army, which made the German officer extremely pleased. He generously rewarded Devyata with sausages and wine. But just as he returned to the barracks, he was spotted by the vengeful traitor. This despicable man, who had betrayed his country for personal gain, deliberately picked a fight and publicly accused Devyata of being a German lapdog. Devyata didn't bother responding to the shameless scoundrel, but unexpectedly, the man became even more aggressive and suddenly landed a heavy punch on Devyata. Unable to tolerate it any longer, Devyata swung the wine bottle and smashed it hard against the traitor's head, but the man still didn't back down and even boasted that he had already known about Devyata's escape plan. Enraged beyond measure, Devyata rushed at him and forcefully stuffed the sausage into the traitor's mouth, choking him to death. But this act brought enormous trouble. Even though Devyata had just rendered a great service to the Germans that morning, he still could not escape punishment. He was ruthlessly tied to a post and brutally beaten with 25 lashes by the Germans. Devyata was beaten within an inch of his life. Barely breathing, had it not been for his unwavering will, he would have perished on the spot. But misfortunes never come singly. Just as one crisis ended, another arrived. The SS suddenly approached Nikolai. Because the barber at Sachsenhausen had been arrested, Devyata's identity was exposed. The SS ordered Nikolai to identify Devyata, but Nikolai refused without hesitation. The officer threatened, "Aren't you afraid Devyata will escape and report you to your father as a traitor?" At that time, Devyata was covered in wounds and hanging on by a thread. His comrades cheered him on constantly, and only with all his strength was he able to stand up again. With victory so close, he had no choice but to grit his teeth and endure. But just as they were preparing to escape again, Nikolai suddenly appeared at the airport like a devil. When Devyata spotted him, his heart sank. He quickly hid and warned the others that they knew each other. If Nikolai recognized him, he would surely be doomed, and they had to act quickly before they could escape. All the POWs were rounded up for Nikolai to identify one by one. Devyata cowered in the crowd, trembling this time. He truly feared there was no way out. As Nikolai slowly approached, just as all hope seemed lost, one comrade suddenly charged forward and grappled with him, risking everything. Another comrade seized the moment and quickly swapped Devyata's position with another POW to help Devyata lead them to freedom. That comrade sacrificed his own life. When Nikolai inspected again, he sensed something wasn't right, but couldn't be sure. Thus, Devyata narrowly escaped disaster, with nothing to show for it. Nikolai left, full of bitterness and unwillingness. They were brought back to the airport to work. After an agonizing wait, lunchtime finally came, possibly their last chance to escape. This time, Vladimir planned to handle the German himself. He crept up behind the vehicle, pulled out a knife, approached the guard pretending to chat, and struck fiercely while the guard was distracted. But the German caught him immediately, and the others rushed forward to help. Because they had long been starving, they were extremely weak and struggled for a long time before finally overpowering him. They hid the body under the vehicle and quickly supported Devyata as they rushed to the hangar. Vladimir swiftly opened the hangar doors while Devyata calmly directed everyone through the pre-flight procedures. Just then, Nikolai, who was driving away, suddenly had a bad feeling and turned his car around. As Devyata prepared to start the plane, he was horrified to find the ignition completely unresponsive. Panicked, he sent someone to get a battery. The team frantically wheeled over a large box and connected it to the plane. The cockpit lights came to life. Confidently, Devyata pressed the ignition button, only to accidentally open the bomb bay doors instead. He scrambled around in the cockpit in a panic and finally found the correct start button hidden in a corner. The plane roared to life with a thunderous blast. Just then, a patrol car sped past in front of them, startling everyone, but it didn't spot them. Once the patrol was gone, they quickly opened the hangar. As Devyata shifted gears and released the brake, he was horrified to find the plane wouldn't move. A comrade checked and found the wheels were blocked. After removing the obstruction, the plane slowly rolled out of the hangar. To avoid detection, Devyata had Vladimir wear a pilot's cap, and the others kept their heads down. They passed under the German guards' noses unnoticed. Unexpectedly, they discovered top-secret V2 missile documents on board. An incredible stroke of luck. With a pounding heart, Devyata finally taxied to the runway. But just then, the guards spotted them and fired a signal flare into the sky. Suddenly, a plane flew overhead. It was another plane coming in to land, giving them a moment of false alarm. Devyata quickly gathered himself, pushed the throttle, and the plane shot down the runway like an arrow. He pulled the controls with all his strength, but the wheels barely lifted before slamming back down. Undeterred, Devyata tried again and again, but the plane stubbornly refused to take off. Worse still, the end of the runway was approaching. At the last second, Devyata slammed the brakes, and the plane skidded into a hair-raising 180-degree turn, narrowly avoiding destruction. Realizing the flaps might not be deployed, he quickly sent Vladimir to check. but as Vladimir stepped out, he saw a swarm of German troops rushing toward them and scrambled back to the cockpit. Devyata gritted his teeth and launched a final, desperate escape attempt. The Germans chased after them in vehicles, firing madly. Devyata pushed the throttle again and quickly outpaced the cars. He opened the tail flaps and pulled with all his strength, but the plane still refused to lift. Everyone rushed forward to help in a frenzy. Suddenly, Nikolai's car blocked the runway. In that critical moment, the plane miraculously soared over the car roof and finally took off. But before they could breathe a sigh of relief, Nikolai's terrified voice suddenly came through the radio, scaring Devyata half to death. Panicking, he looked around while everyone else grew anxious, but Devyata stayed calm and ordered everyone to prepare for battle. Nikolai's fighter jet silently caught up to them and opened fire without hesitation. The bomber's right engine was destroyed, bursting into flames, and warning sirens blared in the cockpit. Despite the chaos, Devyata fought to keep the plane balanced.
Миш, садись. Садись, дурак. Садись.
He ignored the enemy and flew into the clouds to evade pursuit. But Nikolai wasn't done. He aimed again, furious and ready to finish them off. Suddenly, he realized he was out of bullets. Seizing the moment, they launched a counterattack and hit Nikolai's windshield. Devyata, unwilling to kill him, tried to persuade him to return to their homeland.
Да куда я полечу, Миша? Кого я там обрадую? Отца? Новой формой дороже сытой? Полетели домой. Мы скажем, что ты с нами был, Коль. Только пути у меня обратного нет.
But for Nikolai, there was no turning back. He silently flew above the bomber, prepared to die with Devyata. At the last second, Vladimir dismantled the tail gun and fired wildly at Nikolai's jet. The jet caught fire, trailed black smoke, and spun out of control.
Ты прости меня за все. Фаю береги. Миш, отцу не говори.
Не скажу.
Before they could relax, anti-aircraft fire erupted from below like a storm. Even worse, their second engine was hit. Facing a crash, Devyata made the bold decision to attempt an emergency landing. Miraculously, they survived without injury, but before they could rejoice, they were surrounded by soldiers in snow camouflage. To their shock and relief, it was their own people. After enduring countless life and death trials, they were finally rescued and returned to the homeland they had longed for. The secret documents about the V-2 missile helped the Soviet Union develop the V-3 missile and laid the foundation for its future space program. I'm a movie enthusiast. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.